And now it's time for this week's feature interview. In the United States, unsavory organizations with links to terror, such as the Council on American Islamic Relations, can only go so far in attempting to use the legal system to intimidate people into silence on the issue of jihad. The USA has a little thing called a Constitution and a Bill of Rights. One of the rights guaranteed to American citizens is free speech. Here in the UK, not so much. Another attempt is going to be made shortly to ensure that Britons don't say anything that might upset people of other faiths. And we'll leave it to your imagination to work out which particular religion they had in mind while drafting the new restrictions. But amid all the self-congratulatory backpatting and expressions of mutual admiration for how tolerant and open-minded they all are among the political academic media elite, a few brave souls still resist. One is Douglas Murray from the Centre of Social Cohesion, and a jolly splendid organisation it is. Anyway, Douglas Murray is the author of Neoconservatism, Why We Need It, and he speaks here to Shire Network News' senior British social cohesion correspondent, who writes this stuff, about the latest attempt to silence anyone who might want to point out the blinding obvious.
Well, Britain already has laws that give extended sentences to people for racially aggravated assault and so on, and there's a debate to be had on that issue. But what the government in Britain has attempted to do in the last year is to institute a new law, which is the Incitement to Religious Hatred bill, which would make it would make a crime of being insightful against somebody else's religion. Now, I think this is a very different matter from a racial hatred bill. Racial hatred, obviously always despicable, is based on hatred of somebody because of the colour of their skin, on who they were born as, where they were born, and so on. Religious hatred is also a horrible thing for many reasons, but it is effectively, religion is about thought and about belief. And I submit we get into a very difficult area if we are willing to say that criticisms of ideas and beliefs are a bad thing, and that there are some things you can't and shouldn't say. I think we end up in a very bad place if we go down that route.
And who decides what it is we can and can't say or think?
Well, the people who will decide it are the people who pose most as being most sensitive. I mean, the people who will be deciding this law will be people like the Muslim Council of Britain, who had already declared on the public record in 2005 that one of the things that would be made illegal would be saying Islamic terrorists. The head of the MCB at the time, Iqbal Sakrani, said that this too would be made illegal. So I submit that where we end up is, in trying to deal with the problem of Islamic terrorism, you can't even begin to deal with it if you're not even legally allowed to say what the problem is.
Well, this was the whole point behind George Orwell's invention of Newspeak. It was a way of making thought crime literally unthinkable. If you don't have the words, you can't describe what it is. You can't even think straight.
That's right. Now, I mean, we've in Europe, there's already been something attempts along these lines with the guidelines that the European Union recently published, saying that people shouldn't in Brussels be using the term Islamic terrorism or Islamist terrorism, or let alone jihad, that they should be referring, apparently, if you're to refer to it at all, you should be referring to terrorists who abusively invoke the name of Islam. Now, that one doesn't exactly trip off the tongue, but that's what Brussels would have us say. Of course, it's mistaken for a lot of reasons, but not least because it itself makes a theological presumption, which is the abusively evoking the name of Islam. There is an argument, which can be had, that this is not an abuse of Islam, but following the tenets of Islam. There are many people who believe that, and I submit that whether they're right or wrong, they have the right to say it.
If this law is passed, what do you think the long-term effect is going to be?
Well, the long-term effect will be people will be even more cowed than they currently are in identifying the people who are trying to blow them up. the bill, when it was last put before the House during Tony Blair's premiership, lost by one vote. Actually, it was a vote of Tony Blair, who went back to Downing Street thinking that the vote was safe. But Gordon Brown had expressed some time ago the fact that he would like to see this law pushed through when he became Prime Minister, which he now is. What it will mean is that newspaper editors, public figures, politicians, will be even less keen than they currently are on putting their finger on the problem, which is that we live in an era of jihad. We live in an era in which Islamist fundamentalism has reawakened and is doing a pretty good job of asserting itself.
Do you think under this law that the word jihad will be banned?
Well, it's already there. I mean, as I say, the European Union has said that the word jihad is right out. But if you can't call something by its name, your likelihood of being able to defeat it is very, very small indeed.
Where is this coming from? I mean, who's behind this?
It's coming from a supine attitude that presumes that somebody who is an enemy is going to be made less of an enemy if you're a bit nicer to them, and if you mollycoddle them and flatter them.
Because that worked so well in the 1930s.
It works so well all the time, as we know. In that if there are people with a grievance, you should give in to that grievance and flatter that grievance, and then the grievance will disappear. Well, I think it's the opposite. I think that the more you flatter a grievance, the worse that grievance becomes, the more justified the person thinks that grievance is. And that will be the situation we end up in. Fortunately, I think there are still enough people in Britain who do know what's happening, who do recognize the problem, and who are willing to call it by its name. Quite a number of Muslims, I think, among them.
What's the attitude of the general British people to this sort of thing? You get the idea sometimes that there's a political, academic media class that runs things pretty much the same way that they do in Europe, and that people are just fairly happy for them to get on with the business of running the country. Is there any signs that people are getting a bit restive in Britain and don't like this sort of nanny state, we'll tell you what's best attitude? Oh,
yes, very much so. I mean, the disconnect now between the political class and certainly the sort of media class on this one and the general public is, I think, is growing to be fairly profound. Most people in Britain, like most countries, don't like being fibbed to. And there was an interesting example of fibbing recently when the two men, one of whom died the other day, unlamentedly, drove a jeep into Glasgow Airport the other week. One of the people who saw them was interviewed on the BBC. He was interviewed on the BBC and recounted what he'd seen. It was a very interesting, a very good testimony, very sort of vibrant first-hand eyewitness account. In the subsequent broadcasts, it was edited, and one single thing was edited, which was that they edited the mention the man made of the fact that when the two wannabe suicide bombers got out of the jeep, they were shouting "Allah, Allah." Now, I just thought that was a kind of important component of the story. They didn't shout "Buddha, Buddha," or anything else. They shouted "Allah." Now, if the BBC seriously thinks that the British public don't know when people try to keep information like that from them, it represents an incredibly patronizing and patriarchal view that the media seems to have, which is that unless they carefully nuance or not so carefully nuance or fib about what is going on, then the British public will turn into some kind of racist rabid horde that's going to go and lynch Muslims. Well, that's not going to happen. The simple need is to educate the public and tell them what's going on. And I think that if the broadcasters or the government or anyone else tries to keep information from the public, then we're going to end up in a very bad place.
It seems to me you have an elite that basically does not trust its ordinary population.
No, it doesn't. I mean, this is much like the reaction in America. You remember that after 9/11, President Bush almost straight away, went starting going to mosques, started making proclamations about what Islam does and doesn't say. And I think all this is immensely presumptuous. I don't think it's the role of politicians or media to make theological pronouncements about what Islam is as a religion or what any particular religion is. It's not its job, and government is, of course, rather bad at dealing with theological issues, and it's best not to let them have their way with them. But But in that post-9/11 period when, it was drive time at the mosque, when every leader had to rush to a mosque and express solidarity, one of the things behind that was an incredibly patronizing presumption on the part of Bush and other world leaders that their publics were just, as I say, kind of rabid hordes who couldn't wait to get about a bit of Muslim lynching. And there was never any evidence of that, and it was never going to happen, and thank goodness. And of course you have to be careful that you don't pander to genuine racists and extremists. But I don't think that simply telling the public what's happening is pandering to them. I think that's simply giving them what they deserve, which are the facts. And people can make up their own minds. And there's no tradition in Britain of people going around attacking minorities. In fact, we're pretty strict against it. And as I say, I think it's a great offence and a great insult to the public to distrust them.
Isn't there a danger also that by driving any addressing of this issue underground, it risks actually encouraging people to look in the direction of the only other people talking about it, which is extreme right-wing fascist groups like the British National Party? That's
right. That's right. I mean, it's the same in Belgium. I mean, you have an appalling party with an appalling collaborationist past. I'm thinking of the Vlaams Belang, formerly the Vlaams Blok, whose predecessors collaborated with the Nazis and who have a history and a present experience of anti-Semitism, and among other things, one of their members represented Holocaust denial. Now, if you're in Belgium today, though, and you're against the status quo in, say, Brussels, the Vlaams Belang offers you an opportunity to vote elsewhere, and a lot of Belgian people are taking that opportunity, and this will be replicated in other countries. It will be replicated, I'd suggest, in Britain, unless people feel that they're being told the truth and they're being treated as adults, and that there aren't things that are being kept from them. The temptation that they will run towards rabid and disgusting parties like the British National Party increases exponentially.
Why don't the elites trust the ordinary people? Where does this disconnect come from?
Almost impossible to say. Must have been at the start of their life sometime a bad experience when they met the ordinary person. It must have gone badly. I mean, look, the thing with the sort of class that decides these sort of things is that they tend to be there tends to be a sort of group think going on. They generally, I mean, this is certainly the case with the BBC. Generally, it is staffed by people who've been to good universities, who've done liberal arts degrees, and nothing wrong with that, except that it tends to mean that they've only come across a particular type of point of view, which is broadly a point of view which, among other things, flatters itself with the idea that it's liberal, even when it's illiberal, and believes that, they're kind of anti-war rather than pro-war, as if it's as simple as that. And all of the sort of presumptions that go along with that. Therefore, anyone who speaks to the contrary is not just a rarity, but beyond the pale. That's the kind of problem we end up in.
And now, as a special treat to remind you all why you're listening to Shire Network News and not the BBC, this was Douglas's introduction on a recent BBC radio programme called Any Questions.
Douglas Murray is so far the author of just one book, but it too has made a pretty significant impact. His neoconservatism, Why We Need It, has been described by the historian Andrew Roberts as the right's answer to Michael Moore.
Ouch! Did you hear the venom? And of course, Douglas has had 2 books published, his first being a biography of Lord Alphonse Douglas Bosie. And then, listen to this from the end of the show.
Rosemary Jessup. Now Tony Blair is in the diplomatic service, what calling would you think is ideal or the worst job for his buddy George Bush once he leaves the White House?
You can choose either the ideal or the worst. We've got only a moment or two. Yasmin.
Oh, definitely to head up the United Nations, surely. They had to kick his old friend out, so let's have him. He'll make it work, won't he, Douglas?
Douglas Murray?
I'd agree with Yasmin. I'd love to see him go to the United Nations. And simply because I love it as a wrecking manoeuvre to bring down that awful organisation.
Nicholas Evans?
Now try to tell me that the UK isn't doomed.